In this chapter, we're going to talk about sensation, the pathways that carry somatic nerve impulses from the body to the brain, the pathway that carry those impulses from the brain back to skeletal muscles and produce movement, and what we do in between. So how we process that incoming information and then allow an action to occur or not. That process is called integration. Integration can occur in many different places in the central nervous system: the spinal cord, the brainstem, the cerebellum, some of those basal nuclei we talked about, and also in the cerebral cortex, obviously. And then at the end of this chapter, we'll talk about 3 integrative functions of the brain: sleep and wakefulness, learning and memory, and language. So at its most basic definition, sensation is the consciousness or subconsciousness and being aware of changes that occur in the external and internal environment. So some sensory impulses arrive at the spinal cord and may be the input for a spinal reflex, such as the stretch reflex or the withdrawal reflex we saw when we looked at spinal cord. Sensory impulses that reach the lower brain stem are going to cause a more complex reflex, such as changes in heart rate or breathing rate. When sensory impulses reach the cerebral cortex, then we become completely aware of that sensory stimulus, and we can locate and identify exactly where someone is touching us, or exactly where that painful stimulus is located on the body, or where that is stimulating the body. We know specific sounds and sights and taste because of perception. That's the conscious interpretation of sensation, and that, of course, is going to be primarily a function of the cerebral cortex. So each unique type of sensation, pain, vision, hearing, touch, those are all called sensory modalities. So a particular sensory neuron carries information for only one type of sensory modality. So a sensory neuron for taste can't detect light. Okay, a sensory neuron for hearing can't detect smell. Okay, so the neurons relaying those impulses for touch to the somatosensory area of the cortex don't detect or transmit impulses for pain. Okay, so as we look at each of these, we'll divide these different sensory modalities into general or special senses. Special senses will cover quite a bit more in the next and final chapter of the nervous system. So the general senses are going to refer to both somatic senses and visceral senses. So remember, somatic means of the body. So these include the touch and pressure sensations we call tactile. So touch, pressure, vibration, tickle, touch, itch, thermal sensations, warm and cold, painful sensations, and proprio sensations. Remember, proprioceptive sensations are those that allow us to know the position of our body, the movement of the limbs and the head. Your visceral senses are going to provide information about the internal organs: pressure, stretch, chemicals, hunger, nausea, temperature. Okay, so let's begin by looking at the difference. Of course, your special senses include sensory modalities of smell, taste, hearing, vision, equilibrium, or balance. There are different types of sensory receptors, just as we saw with the somatic receptors. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. I just realized as I said it, it didn't sound like I wanted to. There are different types of sensory receptors, of course, that are involved in the different senses. So very specialized receptors, just as we had for temperature and touch and the different somatic senses, the same thing for the special senses as well. But there are different types of receptors based on their structure, not just on what they detect. So we can classify these receptors based on several categories. The first we'll look at just briefly is microscopic structure. So I've got the words here on this slide. The very next slide will be a picture that shows you an example of these. So the first classification are free nerve endings. So remember, dendrites are those sensory receiving parts of a neuron. So bare dendrites, a lot of these are going to be associated with pain, temperature, tickle, itch, and some of those touch sensations, as we mentioned just a minute ago, some of those somatic sensations as well. Encapsulated means to be covered. So these are dendrites that are going to be enclosed in a connective tissue capsule. These will be some of our deeper sensations such as pressure, specialized sensations such as vibration, and some of the other touch sensations, or they may even be separate cells. So the separate cells we'll find very often in special senses, and these are going to synapse directly with sensory neurons. So a lot of these will include the cells that are involved in hearing and equilibrium, and also some of our taste cells and some of the receptors associated with vision. So here you can see an example of each of these. So here we have receptors that are going to be free nerve endings. So they, of course, are just going to be those receptors that detect that stimulus and bring it into the cell. Here you see the encapsulated dendrite, so it's covered with a little capsule, and then the specialized single cell, the separate cell, such as the taste buds, that then, of course, is going to synapse with a sensory neuron to bring that information in. We can also group or classify receptors based on the location of the receptors and the origin of the stimulus that activates them. So exteroceptors are located at or near the external surfaces of the body. So they're sensitive to stimuli that originate outside the body and provide us with information about the external environment. So the sensations of hearing, vision, taste, smell, touch, pressure, vibration, temperature, and pain are all detected by exteroceptors. Interoceptors, sometimes called visceroceptors, are located in blood vessels and visceral organs, muscles within the nervous system, and they help to monitor conditions in the internal environment, so things that are changing going on inside the body. So the nerve impulses produced by interoceptors are usually not consciously perceived, but however, sometimes activation of interoceptors by extremely strong stimulus may be felt as pain or pressure, such as what we detect when we have muscle cramps or stomach aches. Proprioceptors are located in muscles, tendons, joints, and the inner ear. So they help to provide us with information about body position, how muscles stretch, how their length and their tension, the position and the movement of the body. Okay, so proprioceptors detect position. So this slide just gives you all those nice words to put with what we just talked about. Now, the next thing we want to look at is classifying the receptors based on the type of stimulus they detect. So we'll begin by just doing a classification of these. So mechanoreceptors are sensitive to mechanical stimulus such as stretching or bending or deforming cells. So mechanoreceptors provide the sensation of touch, pressure, vibration, the proprioception, hearing, and equilibrium. They also help to monitor the stretching of blood vessels and internal organs. Thermoreceptors, that one should be pretty easy. They're going to detect changes in temperature. Nociceptors detect painful stimulus, so something that can cause the body injury or some sort of damage. Your nociceptors do not adapt. Now, I haven't mentioned adaptation yet, but sensory receptors can adapt, which means basically the cells stop responding. So think about what happens when someone walks into a room and you smell their perfume really, really, really heavily when they walk in. Or you turn the light on in the morning and it's very, very bright and your eyes are just like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. So all of that is that initial detection of that stimulus and processing it, but after a few minutes you stop thinking about that smell or that stimulus. So those receptors have adapted to that stimulus and stopped responding, so we don't process that stimulus continuously. Now I bring that up here because your nociceptors, remember, are your pain receptors. So these do not adapt, and that is very protective of the body, of course, because if there's a painful stimulus, we need to take action to stop that pain from occurring before damage happens to the body. So these receptors do not adapt. Your photoreceptors are going to detect light that hits the retina of the eye. Chemoreceptors detect chemicals that, in the case of taste and smell, those chemicals are dissolved in water. They also help to detect the concentration of body fluids and how that may change. And your osmoreceptors also help to detect chemicals, but I want to change this. This should not say detects chemicals, the same exact thing on the chemoreceptors. What it should say is they detect changes in the osmotic pressure of body fluids. So osmotic pressure, remember, is related to osmosis, so that's going to be related to how much water versus how much stuff is in a solution. So if you have a saline solution and you add more salt to it, you have increased the osmotic pressure. Okay, so body fluids change as well, and your osmoreceptors detect that. Now, however, I'm not going to start this video completely over because there's a typo here. Be sure and make that change.